You are now watching the official YouTube channel for the largest basketball manager game in the world. Join at BuzzerBeater.com if you think you can beat the buzzer.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to Bubbles BuzzerBeater, the official BuzzerBeater YouTube channel. I hope Season 62 treated you well. I know the season just ended and some of you are very happy with a championship or league win where you get to promote to a higher league, so congratulations if that was you. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I know some other people are very happy with the recent draft picks that they got. So all of the draftees were added to rosters, I'd say about 8 to 10 hours ago from when I'm recording this. So in the last day, they have been added to your team. So I hope you either had a successful season, or if you didn't have a successful season, hopefully you got a valuable draft pick. So today I wanted to talk about a kind of part 2 version of the tactic analysis of Season 61 versus Season 62, and just seeing how offenses and defenses have worked under the new modern game engine. But I first wanted to do a shout out for a new BuzzerBeater YouTube channel. His channel name is Carpe the DM, and he has laid out some very, very nice videos for BuzzerBeater topics, and it seems like it's geared a lot more towards like newer managers, but it's a lot of useful information for managers who are just starting the game that really breaks down, basic things about the game that even I haven't covered on my channel. He also he has an insane speaking voice, way better than mine. And I think he's posted 4 or 5 videos up to this point. So I encourage you to go check him out and drop him a like and subscribe. I really like his content. It reminds me a lot of the old Khan Academy videos on YouTube that taught you math concepts and stuff like that, like college algebra, calculus sort of stuff. But it reminds me of that style of video, and I think he's put out some really good content recently, so I encourage you to check him out. But we'll go ahead and get started with the main topic of today's video. So as most of you know, the game engine for Season 62 has been tweaked or adjusted. I cover a lot of this in my first video talking about Season 61 versus Season 62 tactics. But for a recap, essentially, more assists, more points, and essentially passing and assists are just improved. And then some of the offenses have been impacted slightly by these changes and work a little bit differently based on my research and my findings. So what we looked at in the first video was essentially what tactic combination have B3 teams ran successfully and which ones have not worked as well. And there was a little bit confusion as to what exactly I was looking at in that video, so I'd like to break it down a little bit more in depth. But this video, which is the tactic combo win rate percentage comparisons, this is essentially saying Team A ran this offense and this defense, but we don't know what their opponent was running. So it's essentially saying Team A ran look inside 3-2 zone versus tactics unknown against their opponent, and how did that perform. And then Minkoff, he did mention that it was a little bit confusing, and that also a good version or part 2 video for this topic would be seeing how a particular offense does against a particular defense, which I really like, and I thought it was a great suggestion, so I wanted to get the research and statistics for that as well. So in this video, we will specifically be looking at a specific offense versus a specific defense. So in this scenario, Team A, we know that they've ran look inside, but we don't know which defense they ran, versus Team B, who we don't know which offense they ran, but we know that the look inside offense of Team A was going up against Team B's 3-2 zone. So in this one, it's more about offense versus defense. And then the older video that I still encourage you to check out would be the tactic combination of the two. So in this one, it's going to be an offense versus a defense. And then just some notes, a lot of them similar to the last video as well, but The following stats only include B3 games from the group play of Season 61. and Season 62, not any of the knockout stage games or prior seasons before Season 61. And then base offense man-to-man is not included in the findings because that is the inactive bot teams setup, so I didn't want to include those since the numbers were, severely skewed. I also included a non-game day prep game section again, and per usual, this was likely going to be more useful than the all games section just because we don't know what game day preps were hit correctly or incorrectly in those games, so the non-game day prep games are probably more accurate. And then only offensive versus defensive matchups with 15 plus all games played in both Season 61 and 62 are recorded to ensure sample sizes are big enough to actually assess how they've performed and what's changed about them. And then lastly, just keep in mind that regardless of tactics, sometimes just the better team ends up winning and the weaker team, not as good team, ends up losing. So a lot of times if a team's significantly better than their opponent, they can run kind of whatever and they'll win. So just keep that in mind as well. So looking at the first one, this is going to be look inside offense versus man-to-man defense. And as you probably predicted, this is going to be the most common offense versus defense setup for B3 games. So you can see Season 61, there was 175 of these. In Season 62, there's 173 of them. And then for the non-game day prep games, still a lot of them with 130 and 124. And what you can view from this one is that look inside versus man-to-man does not work as well in Season 62 as it did in Season 61. So you go from a 57% win percentage in all games for Season 61 and 62% win percentage for non-game day prep games in Season 61, where you drop 6% in all games and 9% in non-game day prep games for Season 62. So man-to-man defense is working a little bit better against look inside with the passing changes, or look inside just isn't working as well against, defenses in general or man-to-man defense. The average point differential went down slightly, but not significantly, but it really is the win rate percentage that is pretty, it took a pretty substantial dip. Moving on to the next one, it's going to be motion offense versus man-to-man defense. And this is one that's, a little bit more polarizing, or I'm not exactly sure what to read into it. The win rate percentages aren't too different, and neither are the average point differentials. The one thing that does stand out to me is in non-game day prep games, you can see that the win rate percentage from Season 61 to Season 62 goes from about 48.9% up to 53.2%, which is about a 4.3% increase. So it's not super substantial, but it does seem like motion is working slightly better against man-to-man. With that being said, the win rate percentage for all games is about the same. And then the average point differential actually went down pretty dramatically in non-game day prep games. So it was almost as if, some scenarios it worked really well, and then others it didn't work well at all, based on the point differential. But yeah, motion man-to-man, those are the stats. So interesting one to look at. You could always give me your thoughts on what you think. We will go ahead and move on to the next one. This is going to be low post versus man-to-man. And low post is really struggling in Season 62. Season 62, you can see the games of all games 64, non-game day prep games 56. The games played stayed about the same for Season 61 to Season 62, but the win rates and point differential both went down somewhat dramatically. So the win rate percentages, you can see in 61, it was a pretty reliable offense of 56% win rate for all games, 57% win percentage for non-game day prep games. But in Season 62, that drops by 15 to 20%. So I'd say this is one of the offenses that I feel has been impacted the most by the passing changes and might not be working as well. Just because that's a pretty dramatic change from how effective low post has been in the past and in Season 61 to what it's been doing in B3, at least at the highest level in Season 62. Now for Patient. So Patient is one that's another one that's kind of hard to read into, but it does seem like it is working a little bit better in Season 62 than 61. At the same time, just because it's working better doesn't mean it's working well. So even though the win rate percentages have gone up by 7% and 8.4%, the win rate percentage totals are still both pretty low at 36 and 38%. And this does make sense because Patient is typically an offense that, you know, the weaker teams are playing. They're just trying to reduce possessions, get the ball to a specific person, and sometimes these are like reverse Patient games that just don't go well at all. But I'd say Patient technically working better in Season 62 than 61, but still not working well. So it's still not an offense that I think works pretty well. I've never been a huge advocate for like a standard Patient offense. I would say only reverse Patient is something that has worked well for me, but especially at the B3 level when a lot of the power forwards and centers have a lot of outside defense as is, it's probably not working as well at those higher levels. And now for look inside versus 3-2 zone. So look inside versus 3-2 zone, this is one where I was curious to see what the changes would be because my theory was that 3-2 zone would not work as well against look inside, and the data doesn't really prove that. The win rate percentages are both roughly the same, so the win rate percentage against 3-2 zone has actually gone down for look inside in Season 62 for all games, and then it's only gone up by 0.4% for non-game day prep games. So this is one where I was expecting a bigger difference between Season 62 and 61. I'd love to see a larger sample size, you know, more than 43 games for Season 62. But it is something where it's not as big of an effect as I was expecting it to be. I thought look inside would start to crush 3-2 zone. But yeah, I guess there's a lot of room for interpretation on look inside offense versus the 3-2 zone defense. And now for push the ball versus man-to-man. So push the ball versus man-to-man is another fairly common one that you see at all levels of BuzzerBeater. And this is one where in all games, you can see that the win rate percentage goes down somewhat significantly. But for non-game day prep games, it goes up slightly. So another one that's a little bit hard to read. The average point differential also dips somewhat dramatically in Season 62. But I know that push the ball is something that sometimes teams run against really inferior opponents to just stack up point differential, especially with B3 where point differential helps determine seeding and can really determine like your ability to make a Final Four versus an Elite Eight versus a Sweet 16 depending on your matchup. Teams really go all out to build that point differential. But push the ball was another one that didn't really have conclusive evidence, in my opinion, for if it's better, worse, the same, what it looks like. But those are the statistics for it. And then for inside isolation versus man-to-man, similar findings there. So inside isolation is one that I think is working much better. The isolation offenses as a whole, I feel like are working as a slightly better version of a standard Patient offense, because I think the inside isolation and outside isolation offense have done a good job about prioritizing getting the ball to a good player at that position, whether that's a guard or a big man. But the win rate percentages have still stayed similar to the push the ball ones, where win rate percentage for Season 62 compared to 61 for all games took a dip. But for non-game day prep games, it slightly rose by 0.4%. So not a whole lot of evidence there. Once again, we're getting into smaller sample sizes, but inside isolation versus man-to-man isn't showing a whole lot. I thought it would be a little bit more overpowered or perform a little bit better in Season 62 against man-to-man with the changes, but it might just simply be crushing other defensive setups as well, which we will cover in just a little bit. And now for Princeton versus man-to-man. So Princeton offense versus man-to-man defense. This is one of the true winners of this findings or this experiment, because in Season 62 the win rate percentages have both gone up somewhat dramatically, especially for non-game day prep games, where games that do not include game day prep, teams are still winning 50 or 65% of the time in Season 62 playing Princeton against man-to-man. So while Princeton might not do as well against like a 3-2 zone potentially, or some different defenses, Princeton's actually been very, very good against man-to-man at B3 play. And the passing changes, Princeton's always been the weirdest offense to me, but the passing changes could be something that's actually significantly helping a Princeton offense, since Princeton does have an emphasis on passing with it being a slower paced offense, but a lot of like 3-point shots or interior shots. Princeton could be a sneaky offense that's getting a good buff from the modern game engine. And then we have run and gun versus man-to-man. Run and gun versus man-to-man, this is one where you can kind of read a lot into it the way that you see. Win rate percentages for Season 62 have both gone down slightly. 5.4%, 4.2%. These are, once again, slightly smaller sample sizes, but the point differentials have both gone up somewhat dramatically. The point differentials for Season 62 in run and gun offense versus man-to-man defense were insanely high, so I'm assuming that there was a couple bot games where a team won by like 100 plus points. But for the win rate percentages, I'd say slight dip, and then the average point differentials both went up somewhat significantly. So you can read into that. You can read into that what you will, but those are the statistics for run and gun offense versus man-to-man defense. Then we have motion versus 3-2 zone. And this is going to be the biggest kind of factor in why my belief is that the 3-2 zone has been nerfed and isn't working as well. Season 61, if you ever ran motion against a 3-2 zone, you were losing a lot. So you were only winning 26.9% of the time for all games and only 23.8% of the time in non-game day prep games. So essentially motion versus a 3-2 zone was only winning 1 in 4 times. And now in Season 62, motion versus a 3-2 zone has nearly doubled. So the win rate percentages go from 26.9 and 23.8 all the way up to 46.4 and 46.7. So you go from winning like 1/4 of the time to almost winning half of the time. And I'd say that the passing changes probably helped motion break down a 3-2 zone better, but they have performed at a rate that I think is much, much better in Season 62 than in Season 61, where it felt like if you played an outside offense against the 3-2 zone, it was almost an auto loss. And now for low post versus 3-2 zone. Low post is once again not showing out very well. Win rate percentages were really high for Season 61 for low post offense versus a 3-2 zone defense. Sample sizes kind of small, but 54.5% win rate percentage for all games and 75% win rate percentage of the 8 non-game prep games. In Season 62, though, it goes down somewhat significantly. So you can see 39.1% there, 66.7% there. The Season 62 low post offense has not worked well against the 3-2 zone. And honestly, Patient and Low Post both have struggled as like slower paced offenses. The only slow paced offense that's actually worked pretty well is that Princeton offense that we discussed. And now we have look inside versus 2-3 zone. So 2-3 zone is finally making an appearance. Not a whole lot to read into this one. Win rate percentages are pretty low for both Season 61 and Season 62. So 2-3 zone, I think, is working well against look inside offenses, as well as low post, essentially like inside offenses in general. If you have them going up against a good 2-3 zone from like your opponent, it's typically struggling, and there are a lot of like lower scoring games, it seems like. So win rate percentages are both pretty low for Season 61 and Season 62. But the 2-3 zone does seem like it's working pretty well against inside offenses. I just don't know how different that is from Season 61 to Season 62. And now for the zones in general. So this is going to be a layout of the Season 62 games only and their win rates against the 3-2 zone and the 2-3 zone. only including the offenses that were played 3+ times against these zones in non-game day prep games. So you can see the win rate percentage is there. 2-3 zone working pretty well against inside offenses and working pretty well against patient, but not working very well against like push the ball in motion. So 2-3 zone is still susceptible to outside offenses and push the ball, it seems like. But against like a patient offense, even base offense, struggled a bit. But inside offenses, 2-3 zone is working well. And then 3-2 zone, this is where teams in general have performed pretty well against 3-2 zone, where the win rates across the board, I'd say there's nothing that's like dramatically low, like a 25%, 30%. The lowest one is going to be patient against a 3-2 zone, only wins 42.9% of the time, which makes sense because you can't isolate that player as much on offense. But a lot of the other offenses are performing pretty well against the 3-2 zone compared to previous seasons. So these are going to be like my overall findings or my opinion on the modern game engine and just some notes that I have. You don't have to agree with all of them. If you want to push back and have some studies or information behind what you're saying, feel free to let me know either in the BuzzerBeater forums or on the YouTube channel. But it seems like outside offenses are all slightly improved, which makes me wonder if we will see a rise in jump range on BuzzerBeater, where if outside offenses are better, obviously it makes more sense to train higher jump range, even if it's slightly more expensive right now. 3-2 zone appears to be less effective or powerful, likely due to the passing changes, where passing just breaks down in 3-2 zone a little bit better than it has in previous seasons. I think isolation offenses are working nicely as a better version of patient, as I mentioned. I especially like the inside isolation, where it's worked really well with my small forward and power forward in inside isolation, but I imagine it works really well with the center as well. I just think it gives you a good kind of baseline for targeting 2 to 3 players who are good on offense, while kind of avoiding the game day prep of like a low post, look inside if someone's going to guess inside on you, while also keeping a higher pace than a standard patient offense. So I think inside isolation and outside isolation seem to be working as like a better version of patient. And then mentioning the slower offenses, low post and patient have both struggled a lot in Season 62, and it just makes me wonder if the passing changes have impacted slower offenses more, where Princeton might be, nerfed slightly like the other slower offenses because of its pace, but because it's an outside offense, the modern game engine is also making it slightly better. So, Princeton's a little bit of an oddball for that, but low post and patient have both really struggled, so it makes me wonder about the effectiveness of slower offenses in BuzzerBeater for Season 63 moving forward. And then the 2-3 zone, as I mentioned, still working well against inside offenses, and I'm curious to experiment more with it, because not a whole lot of people run a 2-3 zone still in BuzzerBeater. I think the standard is MantoMan or 3-2 zone. But 2-3 zone, I've seen more managers running it at the B3 level, and I imagine that's similar to like lower leagues as well. But it has worked pretty well against inside offenses as a defense in those matchups. And then the last thing is just that the offenses are the most balanced or even that they've ever been in BuzzerBeater's history. This does not mean that the game tactics themselves are like the most balanced ever. I still think defenses are pretty unbalanced because man-to-man is essentially what I run in 90% of the games. Sometimes I'll run a 3-2 zone. I've been experimenting more with like outside and inside box and one. I know some teams have had some success with outside box and one. But the tactics overall, I think they're balanced in theory. The difference where they're not balanced is going to be in skills are in BuzzerBeater. So like jump range, even though outside offenses might be better, jump range is still incredibly expensive. So it's kind of weighing the pros and cons of if it's worth trading a skill that's very expensive for an offense that's improved, or if it's better to just run something like motion or inside isolation, push the ball, things that don't require as much jump range that still work well. And then just getting your thoughts on what are your experiences or findings on the modern game engine. all of you went through Season 62 and had different games, different tactics ran for you, different tactics ran against you. What have you found, or what are your gut instincts on how the game engine has changed, and what do you anticipate BuzzerBeater doing with different training styles and roster builds moving forward in Season 63 based on the findings in Season 62? So lots of interesting questions, but feel free to like and subscribe the video and leave any comments you have down below. I appreciate it. Bye.